The morning of August 6, 2024, brought a dramatic escalation in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian forces, in a surprise move, launched a significant incursion into Russian territory, targeting the Kursk region. This bold offensive, spearheaded by elite units like the 80th Brigade, caught Russian defenses off guard. Ukrainian troops, supported by heavy artillery bombardment, managed to penetrate Russian lines, causing chaos and inflicting casualties. The attack on Kursk marked a distinct shift in the conflict's dynamics. For months, the fighting had been largely contained within Ukrainian borders, with Russia on the offensive. This sudden Ukrainian incursion deep into Russian territory signaled a new phase, demonstrating Kyiv's growing capabilities and willingness to take the fight to the enemy. It also served as a significant morale booster for Ukrainian forces, proving their ability to strike back after months of enduring relentless Russian assaults. The success of the initial assault was attributed to a combination of factors. Firstly, the element of surprise played a crucial role. Russian forces in the region appeared unprepared for such a large-scale attack. This lack of preparedness suggests possible intelligence failures on the Russian side, underestimating Ukraine's capacity to mount such an operation. Secondly, the Ukrainian forces demonstrated a high degree of coordination and effectiveness in their execution of the assault. The 80th Brigade, known for its combat experience and training, played a pivotal role in the operation. Equipped with advanced weaponry and utilizing sophisticated tactics, they were able to quickly overwhelm Russian defenses, creating a breach in the front lines. This initial success allowed other Ukrainian units to pour into Russian territory, consolidating their gains and pushing deeper into the Kursk region. The speed and ferocity of the attack sent shockwaves through the Russian military establishment, forcing a rapid response to contain the situation. Russia, stung by the audacity of the Ukrainian raid, responded with a swift and brutal counterattack. However, instead of focusing solely on the Kursk region, Moscow opted for a two-pronged retaliation strategy. While mobilizing troops to repel the Ukrainians in Kursk, the Kremlin simultaneously unleashed a wave of airstrikes on the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, located in the eastern Donetsk region. These airstrikes, carried out with devastating effect, targeted civilian infrastructure, including residential areas and a hospital. The attack on Pokrovsk resulted in a high number of civilian casualties, drawing international condemnation and accusations of war crimes against Russia. Moscow, however, justified the strikes as retaliation for the Kursk incursion, claiming that the targeted locations housed Ukrainian military assets and personnel. The attack on Pokrovsk served several strategic purposes for Russia. Firstly, it aimed to inflict significant pain on Ukraine, both in terms of casualties and damage to infrastructure, as a way of deterring further cross-border raids. By striking a civilian target, Moscow sent a clear message. Any attack on Russian soil would be met with disproportionate force, targeting not just military objectives but also civilian populations. Secondly, the Pokrovsk airstrikes were intended to divert Ukrainian resources and attention away from the fighting in Kursk. By opening a second front, Russia hoped to force Ukraine to split its forces, potentially slowing down or halting their advance in the north. This strategy aimed to buy time for Russian reinforcements to reach Kursk and mount a counteroffensive to push back the Ukrainian incursion. The decision to strike Pokrovsk, a city with a significant civilian population, was met with widespread international outrage. Human rights organizations condemned the attack as a blatant violation of international law, accusing Russia of deliberately targeting civilians as a means of terrorizing the Ukrainian population. The attack further fueled calls for increased military support for Ukraine, with many Western nations pledging to send additional weapons and ammunition to help Kyiv defend itself against Russian aggression. While the world's attention was focused on the aftermath of the Pokrovsk airstrikes, a fierce battle was raging in the Kursk region. Russian forces, initially caught off guard, had regrouped and were now engaged in a determined counter-offensive to expel the Ukrainian troops from their territory. Reinforcements poured into the region, bolstering Russian defenses and launching counterattacks against the advancing Ukrainians. The fighting in Kursk was characterized by its intensity and brutality. Both sides deployed heavy artillery, tanks, and armored vehicles in a grinding battle for every inch of territory. The flat, open terrain of the region offered little natural cover, making both sides vulnerable to artillery barrages and drone strikes. Casualties were high on both sides as the battle raged on, with no clear victor emerging in the initial days of the conflict. The Ukrainian forces, despite their initial success, faced several challenges in maintaining their offensive in Kursk. Logistical difficulties arose in supplying their troops deep inside enemy territory, as Russian airstrikes targeted their supply lines. Furthermore, the Ukrainians were now facing a more determined and better equipped Russian force, bolstered by reinforcements and determined to defend their homeland. Despite these challenges, the Ukrainian troops fought with tenacity and courage. They had achieved a significant psychological victory by penetrating Russian territory, demonstrating their ability to take the fight to the enemy. The defense of their positions in Kursk became a symbolic battle, a test of Ukraine's resolve to resist Russian aggression. Section 4, Escalation and Risk, a wider war looms. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk and the subsequent Russian retaliation in Pokrovsk marked a dangerous escalation in the conflict, significantly raising the stakes for both sides. The fighting, now spilling across internationally recognized borders, raised fears of a wider regional conflagration, drawing in neighboring countries and potentially escalating into a larger conflict. The situation was further complicated by the potential involvement of NATO. While the alliance had so far refrained from direct military intervention, the attack on a NATO member state's territory could trigger Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which considers an attack on one member as an attack on all. This collective defense clause could potentially draw NATO into a direct military confrontation with Russia, a scenario with potentially catastrophic consequences. The escalation of the conflict also raised concerns about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. Russia, with its vast nuclear arsenal, had repeatedly made veiled threats about using all means necessary to defend its territory. While the use of nuclear weapons remained a highly unlikely scenario, the heightened tensions and rhetoric made it a possibility that could not be entirely dismissed. The international community watched the unfolding events with growing alarm. The conflict, with its potential to spiral out of control, posed a significant threat to global security and stability. Diplomatic efforts intensified, with world leaders urging both sides to exercise restraint and seek a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Section 5. The international stage calls for restraint grow. The events in Kursk and Pokrovsk sent shockwaves through the international community, prompting a flurry of diplomatic activity as world leaders grappled with the escalating crisis. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting to address the situation, with member states expressing grave concern over the escalation of violence and its potential consequences. Condemnation of Russia's actions, particularly the airstrikes on Pokrovsk, was swift and widespread. Western nations accused Moscow of violating international law and committing war crimes by deliberately targeting civilians. Calls for tougher sanctions against Russia intensified, with many nations vowing to provide Ukraine with additional military and humanitarian aid. However, the international community's response was not entirely unified. Some countries, particularly those with close ties to Russia, refrained from explicitly condemning Moscow's actions, instead calling for restraint from both sides. This divergence in opinion reflected the complex geopolitical realities of the situation, with some nations hesitant to alienate Russia entirely. Despite the challenges, diplomatic efforts continued in an attempt to de-escalate the situation and find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Mediators from various countries and international organizations worked tirelessly to facilitate dialogue between Moscow and Kiev, hoping to find a path towards a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement.